Imagine you're looking at just an incredibly dense, globally distributed control panel, like hundreds of dials, overlapping systems, interconnected wires running into the walls and under the floorboard.
Oh, totally. A complete logistical nightmare.
Right. And you pull a lever on the left side, thinking you're just adjusting the ambient temperature, and suddenly 3 distinct red alarms go off on a completely different continent.
Exactly.
That is the reality of modern foreign policy that we are looking at today, and we are taking you, the listener, straight into the room where those levers are currently being manipulated.
It's a really fitting visualization, honestly, because the source material we are unpacking today, it really serves as a masterclass in unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And cascading risks and just the sheer mechanical complexity of managing these interconnected geopolitical systems.
Exactly. So our mission today for this deep dive is to decode a highly revealing, wide-ranging press gaggle that took place at the ASEAN Summit in the Philippines. The source material is the raw, unedited transcript of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a barrage of questions from the global press corps.
Rapid fire stuff.
Yeah, rapid fire. And we're not just going to read you the headlines. Our goal is to take all those flashing red lights on that control panel and actually map the circuitry underneath.
Because it's all connected.
Exactly. From the maritime friction in the South China Sea to the choke points in the Straits of Hormuz, down to a brewing collapse just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and finally into the bureaucratic machinery of the National Security Council itself.
And, as we map that circuitry, we should probably establish the parameters of our analysis for everyone listening.
Good idea.
The geopolitical landscape is, by its very nature, incredibly polarized. But our approach here is strictly diagnostic.
Right, we're not taking sides.
Exactly. We are examining official statements, stated policies, and the strategic viewpoints articulated by the U.S. State Department in this specific transcript. We aren't endorsing these policies or taking political sides.
Yeah, our objective is just to synthesize the worldview being presented impartially. We want to give you a clear read on how the U.S. government currently defines the chessboard.
Exactly. Just looking at the board as they see it.
And looking at that chessboard, there's a really distinct pattern that emerges from the source material. We're going to cover a massive geographic spread today, but almost every single crisis mentioned is anchored to 2 underlying structural forces.
Right, which are fascinating to see play out.
Yeah, it's the vulnerability of global supply chains, specifically, energy and shipping, and then the overarching shadow of nuclear deterrence.
Right, the 2 big ones.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the most complex bilateral dynamic on that board, which is obviously the United States and China.
The big one. Frenemies with global consequences.
Exactly. So the transcript details active preparations for a September visit by President Xi to Washington. The State Department is aiming to lay the groundwork for what they call a very positive visit.
Which is an interesting choice of words given the context.
Seriously. They're setting up working groups, talking about a board of trade, a board of investment to bring concrete deliverables to the table. But the cognitive dissonance here is striking.
How so?
Well, we're setting up bilateral trade boards on one hand, while simultaneously condemning Beijing for aggressively ramming Philippine Coast Guard ships in the South China Sea.
Yeah, that is a jarring contrast.
It's like trying to co-author a book with someone who keeps kicking you under the table.
Yeah.
I mean, how is a working group supposed to function under that kind of kinetic friction?
Well, what's fascinating here is the mechanism driving that dual-track approach. It's really rooted in this doctrine of strategic stability.
Strategic stability.
Yes, the transcript explicitly draws a historical parallel to the Cold War. If you analyze the most dangerous periods between the United States and the Soviet Union, both sides went to great lengths to keep military-to-military and diplomatic channels functional.
Like the red phone on the desk type of thing.
Exactly. They were fighting proxy wars globally, yet they maintained those hotlines. The current U.S. strategy with China operates on a very similar logic, just updated for a hyper-globalized economy.
But that assumes a level of compartmentalization that seems almost, impossible to sustain. The State Department acknowledges that these 2 systems are fundamentally opposed.
Right.
And the transcript admits these differences aren't going to be resolved anytime soon.
Yeah.
So if there's no illusion of alignment, why put so much political capital into this huge September summit?
Because the alternative is deemed catastrophic. The key phrase the secretary uses is that it would be reckless and irresponsible not to manage the friction.
Reckless and irresponsible.
Yes. The U.S. recognizes that an unchecked conflict, whether that manifests as a kinetic military engagement over Taiwan or a chaotic, unmanaged economic decoupling, it would just shatter the global economy.
It would be a nightmare for everybody.
Right. The objective of these working groups isn't to actually fix the underlying ideological rift, it's to install guardrails.
Guardrails.
You manage the friction so that an incident in the South China Sea doesn't automatically trigger, say, a sovereign debt crisis or a localized military escalation.
Okay, installing guardrails is one thing, but let's look at how the U.S. is actually trying to change Chinese behavior on specific friction points, like the fentanyl crisis.
Right, that's a huge issue right now.
It really is. The transcript notes that U.S. law enforcement was actually in China on the very day of this press gaggle.
Really?
Yeah. They're following up on a reciprocal visit Chinese law enforcement made to Washington. But the U.S. isn't just applying moral pressure here. They're attempting to fundamentally alter Beijing's risk calculus regarding precursor chemicals.
It's a highly pragmatic diplomatic maneuver, honestly. The traditional approach of demanding crackdowns based on the damage being done inside the United States just hasn't yielded sufficient results.
Right, because why would they care, essentially?
Exactly. So the U.S. argument has pivoted to self-interest. They're making the case to Beijing that the transnational criminal syndicates currently exploiting this precursor chemical trade to target the West will inevitably turn their logistical networks inward.
Wait, meaning they'll start selling inside China?
Essentially, yes. The argument is that this gray market chemical industry will eventually pose a severe domestic security threat to China and its immediate neighbors.
I find that argument fascinating, but maybe a bit optimistic. You're asking a state apparatus to crack down on a highly profitable export industry based on a theoretical future threat to themselves.
It's a tough sell.
It really is. Now, the transcript does note that China has begun to adhere to some commitments made earlier in the year, but it frames this very much as a work in progress.
Which is diplomatic speak for, we're barely getting anywhere.
Exactly. It really underscores how deeply an American domestic public health crisis is intertwined with Asian regulatory enforcement.
Absolutely.
But chemical exports are just one layer of this. The reporters push really hard on human rights, specifically referencing a researcher named Menzin who was arrested in Yunnan province.
Right, the researcher working on Myanmar issues.
Yeah. This illustrates the tightrope perfectly. How do you aggressively negotiate for the release of your citizens without blowing up the macroeconomic summit prep?
You do it through rigorous bureaucratic segmentation. Diplomacy at this level rarely operates on a single frequency.
Meaning they split it up between different departments.
Exactly. You have the macroeconomic track handling the Board of Trade discussions, and simultaneously you utilize consular channels and quiet embassy engagements to address detainees.
But didn't the reporter ask something specific about his status?
Yes, and that highlights a critical bureaucratic hurdle. The reporter asks if Menzin has been officially designated as wrongfully detained.
Which sounds like just a phrasing thing.
It sounds like it, but in the context of the State Department, that is not a casual descriptor. It is a rigid legal classification under the Levinson Act.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Achieving that designation shifts the case from standard consular affairs to the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs.
That's a big jump.
Huge jump. It unlocks entirely different negotiating tools, intelligence assets, and funding. The Secretary's deflection on the status indicates that the interagency review process required to make that legal determination is still underway.
Which have to be incredibly frustrating for the press and the families demanding immediate high-level intervention.
Oh, absolutely. It's agonizing.
That bureaucratic friction makes sense, but it's a tough reality to swallow when you're dealing with individuals in foreign custody. Yet, amidst all this tension, the trade disputes, maritime rammings, detained citizens, there is a moment in the transcript where the U.S. and China are in absolute alignment.
And it's probably not what people expect.
Not at all. China has publicly opposed any restraint on freedom of navigation or tolling in the Straits of Hormuz. And the reason for that alignment isn't rooted in shared values. It's rooted in raw commodity economics. China requires massive, uninterrupted flows of Middle Eastern oil to maintain its industrial base.
They need that oil.
They desperately need it. And that mutual dependency on maritime choke points brings us directly to the situation in the Middle East and the U.S. assessment of Iran. which, by the way, introduces one of the most compelling strategic frameworks I have seen in a long time.
The Iranian situation, as it's detailed in the source material, really represents a profound intersection of domestic economic failure and asymmetric military strategy.
Yeah, the Secretary's assessment of Iran's domestic situation is brutal. He describes a state wrestling with runaway hyperinflation, crippling food costs, and just a hollowed-out domestic economy.
And they don't blame sanctions for this?
Exactly. The U.S. explicitly places the blame for this not on international sanctions, but on 2 decades of deliberate capital misallocation by the regime. Instead of upgrading their civil infrastructure or diversifying their economy, they've funneled their national wealth into sponsoring proxy networks, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and developing vast arsenals of drones and ballistic missiles.
And that arsenal is key to their entire strategy.
Yes, because it was the phrase used to categorize this arsenal that really stood out. The transcript refers to it as the conventional shield. I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because it reframes the entire Iranian nuclear threat.
What's fascinating here is that the conventional shield concept is basically essential for understanding the current kinetic environment in the Middle East.
Okay, walk me through it.
Well, if a state is attempting to cross the nuclear threshold, their absolute most vulnerable period is the breakout window.
The breakout window.
Yeah.
That's the time between when they start enriching weapons-grade material and when they actually have a bomb.
Precisely. It's the time between when the international community realizes they are enriching that material and the moment they actually have a deliverable warhead.
Right, because during that window, they invite a massive preemptive military strike against their facilities.
Exactly. Once they have the warhead, deterrence changes entirely. But during the assembly phase, they are a sitting duck.
Okay, so where does the shield come in?
The U.S. assessment is that Iranian strategists understood this vulnerability completely. So they sought to engineer a deterrent before the breakout.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Over the past 20 years, they built this overwhelming decentralized arsenal of conventional munitions. We're talking tens of thousands of cheap, highly capable drones and precision-guided missiles. This is the shield.
So the goal was to basically have so many missiles pointed everywhere that no one would dare strike the nuclear facilities.
Exactly. The strategic endgame was to deploy the shield so densely across the region that if the world threatened a preemptive strike on their nuclear facilities, Iran could credibly threaten to unleash the shield.
Just overwhelming regional air defenses.
Right. Overwhelming air defenses, devastating critical energy infrastructure in neighboring states, and effectively holding the global economy hostage. They aim to create a conventional deterrent strong enough to grant them immunity while they finalize the nuclear program.
That is a brilliant, albeit terrifying, asymmetric strategy. You build the fortress to protect the weapon you haven't even finished building yet.
It's very calculated.
But here is the flaw in that logic, based on the transcript. They aren't keeping the shield in reserve. They are actively utilizing it, or at least allowing their proxies to utilize it right now. Commercial shipping is being targeted in the Red Sea and the Gulf.
And that premature deployment is the crux of the current U.S. military response.
How so?
The operations we are seeing, intercepting drones, defending shipping lanes, conducting targeted strikes against launch facilities, they are framed by the U.S. not just as immediate force protection. It's a systematic degradation of that conventional shield. By forcing the regime and its proxies to expend these munitions now, and by actively dismantling the infrastructure required to launch them, the U.S. and its partners are attempting to strip away that protective layer before the nuclear umbrella is ever realized.
So they're basically forcing Iran to burn through its ammunition early.
Exactly.
But the diplomatic audacity accompanying this military strategy is just staggering to me. The transcript outlines a very specific recent diplomatic breakdown.
The MOU issue?
Yes. There was apparently a memorandum of understanding in place, an explicit agreement where Iran was scheduled to issue a public statement guaranteeing free and fair navigation through the Straits of Hormuz.
Right.
And on the exact day they were supposed to release that statement, they targeted a commercial vessel instead.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, how does the State Department even begin to model a diplomatic path forward when the counterparty operates with that level of blatant contradiction?
Well, it fundamentally degrades the trust required for any durable diplomatic architecture. When a state violates a written MOU on the very day of its implementation, it signals to the U.S. interagency that the opposing system is either hopelessly fractured internally.
Meaning the diplomats making the deals don't control the guys firing the missiles.
Exactly. It means the diplomats have no control over the IRGC elements launching the attacks. Or the other option is that they are acting in complete bad faith.
Right.
Either scenario forces the U.S. to shift its primary posture from negotiated settlements to raw physical deterrence.
And the economic weight of maintaining that physical deterrence is just massive. We're talking about the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Critical choke points.
Yeah, the transcript emphasizes that roughly 20% of global oil flows through these corridors. Currently, the U.S. Navy is bearing the overwhelming brunt of defending these lanes. But the State Department is actively pivoting to allies in Europe and Asia, essentially demanding greater burden sharing.
And the burden sharing argument presented here is highly specific.
Right, they aren't just asking for money.
No, the U.S. isn't just asking for diplomatic solidarity. They're requesting highly specialized naval assets. The transcript explicitly cites the need for mine-clearing ships.
Mine-clearing ships, so it's not just shooting down drones.
Exactly. This indicates that the threat environment involves complex, asymmetric maritime warfare capabilities that the U.S. prefers not to handle unilaterally. Furthermore, the diplomatic argument the U.S. is making to these allies is quite blunt.
Let me guess, you need this oil more than we do.
That's exactly it. The energy flowing through these straits is primarily destined for European and Asian economies, not ours. Therefore, your defense budgets need to reflect that reliance.
That is a sharp point. And the transcript actually takes a fascinating economic detour here. It notes that global energy supply chains have already permanently realigned due to this instability.
The shift toward U.S. energy.
Yeah. Many countries in the region, and specifically in Asia, are now purchasing more LNG and crude oil directly from the United States than at any point in history. So the instability in the Middle East has ironically cemented the U.S. as a primary energy exporter to the very allies they are asking for naval assistance.
It's a huge shift in the geopolitical economy.
It really is, but the immediate threat remains acute. The Houthis are sustaining their campaign in the Red Sea, and the transcript draws a direct logistical line back to Tehran. It references direct flights from Iran to Yemen carrying IRGC personnel.
Which proves it's not just a proxy acting on its own.
Right, this isn't a grassroots proxy war. It is a state-directed campaign to militarize critical choke points. So if Iran's ultimate goal is a nuclear umbrella, that brings us face-to-face with the broader architecture of global nuclear deterrence.
How do the established superpowers manage this proliferation pressure?
Exactly. This connects directly to the transcript's focus on Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the future of arms control.
And, the transition from Middle Eastern proxy conflicts to Eastern European diplomacy may seem disjointed geographically, but conceptually, it's totally bound by the same underlying currency of power, which is nuclear leverage.
We see that leverage in a highly anticipated, albeit quiet, meeting mentioned in the source material between the U.S. Secretary of State and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
On the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit.
Yeah. The stated objective was to probe for conditions that might eventually lead to an end to the war in Ukraine. During the gaggle, a reporter asks a really poignant question. Why is the U.S. seemingly the only actor capable of brokering this?
Right, why not Europe?
Exactly. The transcript literally positions the U.S. as uniquely capable of bringing this conflict to a close. Why not a coalition of European nations or the UN?
Well, the U.S. position rests on a dual-pronged leverage that is entirely unique in the international system.
What's the first prong?
First, they are the indispensable logistical and financial spine of the Ukrainian war effort. Therefore, any durable peace settlement requires Washington's explicit security guarantees. Ukraine isn't going to sign a deal without the U.S. backing it up.
That makes sense. And the second?
Second, and perhaps more structurally significant, the U.S. and Russia possess the vast majority of the world's nuclear weapons.
Fine.
The transcript makes a pragmatic argument. Despite the deep systemic rupture caused by the invasion of Ukraine, it would be strategically reckless to sever all diplomatic channels with Moscow simply because of the sheer density of their nuclear arsenal.
It's the ultimate realpolitik. You have to keep the hotline plugged in no matter what is happening on the ground in Eastern Europe, because the risk of a miscalculation escalating to a strategic nuclear exchange basically overrides all other diplomatic concerns.
Absolutely.
But the war in Ukraine has obviously paralyzed traditional bilateral arms control. And the transcript touches on a structural shift that makes future agreements infinitely more complicated.
This is one of the most critical structural realities detailed in the source material. For decades, nuclear arms control was an exclusive bilateral dialogue between Washington and Moscow. Think of the START treaties.
Just the two of them in a room.
Exactly. But the U.S. is now formally articulating that in the 21st century, any credible arms control framework must be tri-party. It must include China.
But I want to push back on the feasibility of that because the reporters immediately highlight the fatal flaw in that requirement.
China doesn't want to play.
Right? China has consistently and vehemently refused to enter into these negotiations. Their strategic logic has always been, the U.S. and Russia possess thousands of warheads. We possess a fraction of that amount. We will not sit at a table and agree to limits until we have achieved numerical parity with your arsenals.
Which presents a terrifying strategic paradox.
Because it means they have to build thousands of nukes just to agree to stop building nukes.
Exactly. China's prerequisite for entering arms control negotiations implies a massive, unchecked nuclear buildup just to reach the starting line.
That is wild.
The U.S. stance outlined in the transcript is that the bilateral era is over, and Chinese participation is non-negotiable. But finding a mechanism to incentivize Beijing to cap its arsenal before reaching parity is arguably the most complex diplomatic puzzle of this decade.
I can imagine.
If you lack a framework for even counting warheads, let alone restricting them, the stability of the entire global deterrence model degrades.
And that degradation isn't limited to adversaries. The pressure extends directly to U.S. allies.
Right, the Saudi Arabia situation?
Exactly. During the gaggle, there's a pointed question regarding a Wall Street Journal report that the U.S. is nearing approval of a civilian nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia.
A very sensitive topic.
Super sensitive. The secretary deflects the specifics, pushing the official announcement to the White House, but he pairs that deflection with an incredibly rigid policy statement.
He offers what is essentially an ironclad guarantee. He states unequivocally that the United States will not reach any agreement with any nation that introduces the risk of nuclear proliferation.
But let's look at the mechanics of a civilian nuclear deal. If you provide the technology for domestic uranium enrichment for power generation, you are inherently providing the foundational knowledge for weaponization.
The science is the same.
Right. The leap from civilian enrichment to weapons grade is a matter of time and intent, not a fundamentally different science. If we connect this to the broader picture, Saudi Arabia's sudden push for nuclear capability is entirely reactionary to the Iranian threat we just discussed.
It's the classic domino theory applied to nuclear proliferation.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia's strategic calculus is dictated by its proximity to Iran. If they believe the international community, and specifically the U.S., cannot permanently prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold, Riyadh will view achieving parity as an existential necessity.
They're going to want their own bomb.
Exactly. The U.S. interagency is attempting to thread a microscopic needle here. They need to lock in a historic strategic alignment with Saudi Arabia, potentially involving normalization with Israel, while strictly enforcing the non-proliferation gold standard.
That seems impossible.
If they offer a compromise agreement to Riyadh, it risks triggering a rapid, highly volatile nuclear arms race across the entire Middle East.
It's just a staggering set of variables to manage simultaneously. You're trying to maintain a frozen bilateral deterrence with Russia, force a rising China into a tri-party framework they reject, preempt an Iranian breakout by degrading their conventional shield, and assure Saudi Arabia so they don't trigger a regional arms race.
It is a lot.
These are monumental crises playing out on the other side of the globe. But the transcript abruptly pivots the focus to a crisis that is geographically intimate.
Right, 90 miles away.
Exactly. The source material outlines a situation it literally characterizes as a failed state, located just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Oh.
I want to unpack the collapse of Cuba, because the economic mechanics detailed here are completely counterintuitive.
The language employed by the State Department to describe the Cuban situation is unusually stark, bypassing standard diplomatic hedging to describe an absolute systemic failure.
Sark is putting it mildly. The secretary describes a demographic and economic freefall. The claim is that Cuba has hemorrhaged between 10% and 15% of its entire population just since 2021.
Think about the sheer scale of that migration.
A nation losing over a tenth of its people in 3 years is a demographic catastrophe.
It really is.
The U.S. attributes this exodus to a uniquely backward, centrally planned economic model managed by an entrenched regime. But there was a specific economic mechanism highlighted in the transcript that completely reframed my understanding of this collapse.
The Venezuelan oil connection.
Yes. Historically, the narrative around Cuba's economic woes centers heavily on the impact of the U.S. embargo. But the transcript pinpoints a completely different catalyst for this recent hyper-accelerated downward spiral.
Yeah, the collapse of the Venezuelan oil arbitrage arrangement. It's a vital piece of the economic puzzle that is often overlooked in broader discussions about the island.
Let's break down how this actually worked, because it is wild. The transcript states that Cuba's immediate crisis was triggered when they stopped receiving shipments of essentially free crude oil from Venezuela.
Right.
But the critical detail is that Cuba wasn't utilizing the majority of this oil to power their own domestic electrical grid.
No, they were reselling it.
The U.S. alleges that Havana was taking roughly 60% of that subsidized Venezuelan crude and flipping it on the open global market for hard cash.
It wasn't an energy subsidy at all.
No. It was a massive geopolitical arbitrage scheme that provided the regime with the liquidity necessary to maintain the state apparatus.
It was free money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once the Venezuelan economy collapsed and that pipeline of free oil dried up, the Cuban regime lost its primary source of hard currency, and the domestic economy simply vaporized.
What this dynamic illustrates is that the Cuban state, as currently structured, functions less like a sovereign nation managing its internal resources and more like a dependent entity reliant on external patronage for baseline survival.
First the Soviet Union, then Venezuela.
Exactly. During the Cold War, that patron was the Soviet Union. In the early 21st century, it was Hugo Chávez's Venezuela. Without a foreign sponsor providing massive artificial capital injections, via the oil arbitrage in this case, the inherent structural flaws of their command economy became impossible to obscure.
But let me push back on the regime's logic here. If the state is quite literally disintegrating and 15% of your tax base and labor force has fled the country, why refuse to implement market reforms?
It seems counterintuitive.
Right. The transcript explicitly states the U.S. is willing to facilitate economic normalization if certain democratic metrics are met. Why would the leadership choose to preside over a demographic collapse rather than reform a system that is demonstrably failing?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture from the perspective of an entrenched authoritarian apparatus, economic liberalization is viewed as an existential threat to political control.
Meaning if people have money, they have power.
Exactly. The transcript argues that the Cuban regime fundamentally fears economic prosperity for its citizens. If the Cuban populace achieves financial independence, if a robust middle class emerges that isn't reliant on the state for basic sustenance, the regime loses its primary lever of social control.
That is so bleak.
The cynical calculus is that a poverty-stricken, dependent population is easier to manage, even in a state of slow collapse, than an empowered, economically mobile citizenry demanding political enfranchisement.
That is a brutally cold calculus. You prefer to rule the ashes rather than share power in a functioning state.
Yep.
And navigating that hostility complicates even basic humanitarian efforts. The transcript notes that the U.S. has initiated $100 million in humanitarian assistance, but they're utilizing a highly specific distribution model.
You have to be careful with the funds.
Right, they're routing these funds exclusively through non-governmental entities on the ground to ensure the regime cannot siphon the capital to fund its security services.
Because otherwise the government would just take it.
Exactly. But the friction with Havana isn't just about managing a localized economic collapse. It has active, aggressive intelligence dimensions.
The declassified report.
Yeah. The reporters bring up a recently declassified U.S. intelligence report detailing foreign communist interference inside the United States, specifically efforts designed to manipulate U.S. foreign policy and exacerbate domestic societal divides.
Which is a bold strategy for a collapsing state.
Seriously. The secretary points directly at Havana, labeling the Cuban regime as the intellectual authors of these asymmetric destabilization tactics across the Western Hemisphere.
And this elevates the issue from a tragic regional failure to an active national security concern.
Definitely.
The U.S. views Cuba not merely as a victim of its own economic mismanagement, but as a persistent, sophisticated adversarial intelligence hub. Their geographic proximity, combined with their historical expertise in ideological subversion and their willingness to host other U.S. adversaries, means the State Department must treat Havana as a multidimensional threat, not just a humanitarian crisis.
Okay, so let's step back and look at the aggregate pressure on the system. We have Cuba actively destabilizing the hemisphere while collapsing internally. We have the U.S. Navy stretched across the Middle East defending commercial shipping from Iranian proxies. We have the diplomatic bandwidth consumed by managing the Ukraine conflict and a belligerent Russia.
It's a lot of spinning plates.
Every single one of these crises exerts immense gravitational pull on U.S. resources, alliances, and specifically the physical military supply chain,
Right.
which brings us to a massive structural vulnerability detailed in the transcript: the strain on the defense industrial base and the resulting squeeze on U.S. allies.
This is where the abstract concepts of diplomatic commitments collide violently with the physical realities of manufacturing capacity and industrial logistics.
Let's look at Taiwan as the primary example.
Yeah.
We established earlier that managing the friction with China is the defining geopolitical challenge. The most volatile friction point in that relationship is the U.S. commitment to arming Taiwan.
Right.
But the transcript reveals a startling bottleneck.
Huh.
A major, highly anticipated U.S. arms sale to Taipei is currently frozen, tied up in an internal review process at the State Department.
Which is terrible timing.
Terrible. If you are a defense planner in Taipei,
Yeah.
watching Chinese Coast Guard vessels aggressively maneuver in the South China Sea, and you are told your critical defense systems are delayed by bureaucratic review, that creates a profound sense of strategic vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely.
I was trying to conceptualize how this happened. Here's where it gets really interesting. We often think of the U.S. military supply chain as an infinite reservoir, but it's functioning more like a fractional reserve banking system applied to global security.
That's a great analogy.
The U.S. has issued security guarantees to dozens of allies globally, essentially promising that if a crisis hits, the industrial base will surge and provide the necessary munitions. But then a massive sustained conflict erupts, like the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
and there's a run on the bank. The U.S. drains its reserve stockpiles to support Kyiv. Now, when Taiwan comes to the window to claim the systems they were promised, the U.S. is forced to admit the vault is dangerously low, and they need time to manufacture new inventory.
Yeah, fractional reserve security is a highly accurate way to frame the dilemma. Defense analysts frequently refer to this as the Ukraine effect.
The Ukraine effect.
Yes. The transcript explicitly acknowledges this physical constraint. The sheer volume of artillery, precision munitions, and air defense systems required to sustain the Ukrainian military has severely depleted U.S. domestic stockpiles.
And we can't just build more instantly.
Right. The assumption that the U.S. defense industrial base could instantly pivot to wartime production levels has proven false. The U.S. is now trapped in a zero-sum logistical nightmare, forced to triage its own domestic readiness against the immediate survival needs of Ukraine and the critical deterrence requirements of Taiwan.
And restarting that industrial base is a glacial process. You cannot simply surge production of Patriot missiles or HIMARS systems overnight.
Not at all.
It requires securing specialized raw materials, expanding complex manufacturing facilities, and training highly specialized labor forces. The supply chains for solid rocket motors and specialized alloys are incredibly brittle.
And adversaries know this.
They do. While the U.S. struggles to untangle these bottlenecks, adversaries are actively exploiting the window of vulnerability. This is evident in the transcript's discussion of Japan.
Right, the economic coercion.
The reporters highlight that Tokyo is currently facing intense, simultaneous pressure from Beijing. The transcript points to aggressive military posturing, but more importantly, it highlights targeted export controls.
This is huge.
China is actively weaponizing trade, restricting access to critical materials to coerce Japanese policy. The U.S. reiterates its ironclad treaty obligations to defend Japan, but how do treaty obligations function in a non-kinetic economic conflict over rare earth minerals?
They function very poorly, which is why economic coercion is the preferred tool for systemic adversaries. A mutual defense treaty guarantees a military response to a kinetic attack. It does not automatically resolve a supply chain embargo on semiconductor precursors.
Right, you can't shoot a supply chain issue.
Exactly. The U.S. and Japan are being forced to rapidly develop joint economic security protocols, de-risking critical supply chains and investing in alternative processing infrastructure because traditional military deterrence cannot shield an economy from targeted export controls.
And as the U.S. attempts to solidify its alliances in the Indo-Pacific, we see some highly unorthodox alliance shifting occurring in the Middle East. There is a deeply counterintuitive moment in the transcript regarding U.S. policy towards Syria.
This one really stood out.
Historically, the Assad regime has been a fierce adversary of the U.S., heavily sanctioned and deeply aligned with Iran and Russia. Yet the transcript confirms that the U.S. has actually removed Syria from the official list of state sponsors of terrorism.
Which sounds completely backwards.
The stated objective is to facilitate economic revival in a nation devastated by a decade of civil war. But let's analyze the strategic calculus here, because on paper, removing a key Iranian ally from the terror list seems like a massive unforced error. Why give up that leverage now?
It is a profound exercise in realpolitik, prioritizing immediate tactical objectives over ideological consistency.
Okay, what's the tactical objective?
The U.S. assessment is that the Syrian state is dangerously fragile. The transcript emphasizes that ISIS elements remain a viable, reconstituting threat within Syrian territory.
So they want Syria to fight ISIS.
Right. The U.S. strategy is to heavily incentivize the Assad regime to focus its limited military and administrative capacity inward on stabilizing its domestic economy and actively suppressing ISIS, rather than projecting power outward or engaging in direct conflict with Hezbollah.
But wait, Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organization and a primary adversary of U.S. interests in the region. If the Syrian military were to clash with Hezbollah, wouldn't that serve U.S. interests by degrading a mutual enemy? Why is the U.S. actively trying to prevent that friction?
Because a direct, kinetic conflict between the Syrian military and Hezbollah risks catastrophic state collapse in Damascus, which would create a massive security vacuum for ISIS to exploit. The U.S. is aiming for a much more precise logistical outcome. They are using the economic leverage of removing the terror designation to pressure Syria into securing its border with Lebanon.
Securing the border. Okay, so that cuts off supply lines.
Exactly. By effectively locking down the porous Syrian-Lebanese border, Damascus can sever the critical logistical arteries that Iran uses to resupply Hezbollah with advanced weaponry.
Oh, wow.
The U.S. is attempting to degrade Hezbollah's operational capacity indirectly by manipulating the self-interest of a neighboring authoritarian state rather than risking a wider regional conflagration.
We will ease the economic chokehold on your regime, provided you quietly lock the back door so Hezbollah can't rearm. That is an incredibly complex, multi-layered diplomatic maneuver.
It's next-level diplomacy.
But it raises a fundamental operational question. If you look at the sheer volume of what we have discussed, calibrating the exact flow of solid rocket motors to Taiwan versus Ukraine, executing multi-agency sanctions against Chinese chemical shell companies, negotiating back-channel border enforcement in Syria, and monitoring black market oil shipments out of Venezuela, the administrative overhead required to manage this is just staggering.
It requires a massive bureaucracy.
Which brings us to our final section, looking under the hood of U.S. foreign policy. How is the bureaucracy actually structured to process this much simultaneous data? The transcript provides a surprisingly philosophical look at the role of the National Security Council.
The discussion surrounding the NSC in this gaggle is genuinely revealing because it highlights a fundamental debate about where expertise should reside and how executive power should be wielded.
The reporters pressed the secretary on the size and scope of the NSC, contrasting it with previous administrations. They note that under the Obama administration, the NSC grew into a massive apparatus.
A huge staff.
Yeah. But the current philosophy outlined in the transcript advocates for a radically streamlined structure. The secretary argues that the NSC had ballooned to an unsustainable size, peaking at roughly 300 to 400 personnel, and asserts that a bureaucracy of that scale is unnecessary for its intended function.
Right.
Let's break down the mechanics of this. How does a principals committee meeting function differently when you have a 400-person NSC versus a heavily downsized one?
Well, in the bloated model, the NSC effectively functions as a parallel State Department. It houses its own deep bench of regional directors and subject matter experts who often end up drafting and driving policy directly from the West Wing, sometimes bypassing or overruling the traditional agencies.
So they're doing the job of the State Department from the White House.
Exactly. The leaner model described in the transcript represents a deliberate decentralization of analytical power. The philosophy is that the deep, granular expertise should reside within the legacy agencies.
Like State, Treasury, Defense.
Right. The diplomats at State, the financial analysts at Treasury, the logisticians at Defense, and the analysts within the intelligence community. In this construct, the NSC is stripped down to its core function, a traffic cop.
A traffic cop.
Its role is strictly to coordinate the interagency process, synthesize the disparate intelligence into actionable options for the president, and then rigorously monitor the agencies to ensure they are executing the president's directives.
Right, so the NSC isn't writing the policy. They are just making sure Treasury and State are actually talking to each other and driving in the same direction.
Precisely.
The transcript refers to this as facilitating a highly hands-on approach from the president, suggesting the ultimate decision-making is heavily centralized in the Oval Office while the execution is pushed out to the departments.
And that coordination is vital.
We see the absolute necessity of flawless interagency coordination when dealing with issues like hostage diplomacy. The transcript touches on the agonizing reality of negotiating the release of wrongfully detained Americans from Iran.
Which is an incredibly fraught situation.
How do you physically maintain a negotiating channel with a regime while the Department of Defense is simultaneously launching airstrikes against their proxy forces in the Red Sea?
It requires an extreme degree of diplomatic and operational compartmentalization. You establish quiet channels, often facilitated by third-party intermediaries like Oman or Qatar, that are completely insulated from the kinetic military operations.
So the people bombing don't talk to the people negotiating.
Exactly. The diplomats operating in those channels must maintain a singular focus on the detainee issue, explicitly decoupling it from the broader geopolitical conflict.
Which has to be incredibly difficult when the other side is furious about the airstrikes.
The transcript acknowledges the immense difficulty of this, noting that the current environment is hardly the most productive moment for dialogue. Yet it also points to recent successes, highlighting that an American was recently secured precisely because the interagency apparatus maintained the integrity of that dedicated channel, even as the regional security situation deteriorated.
It's a grim, highly clinical aspect of modern statecraft.
It really is.
And just to illustrate how chaotic the operating environment really is, right in the middle of these high-stakes discussions about nuclear arms control and hostage extraction, a reporter throws an absolute curveball.
Oh, the Tate question?
Yes. They asked the secretary if the U.S. government plans to intervene in the extradition challenge of the Andrew Tate brothers in Romania, noting that the defense lawyers had specifically invoked the secretary's name.
Just a bizarre pivot.
It is such a jarring moment in the transcript. The secretary immediately deflects, stating he hasn't followed the details due to his travel schedule, and emphasizing that there is generally no role for the U.S. government to intervene in a foreign judicial process of that nature.
Right.
But it serves as a stark reminder of the fragmented information environment these policymakers are operating in. You have to be prepared to pivot from tri-party nuclear strategy to an internet celebrity's legal drama in a fraction of a second.
And then immediately pivot to something else.
Exactly, because just as quickly, the transcript pivots to a slow-burning strategic issue. Myanmar, also referred to as Burma. The host questions the potential for re-engaging with the military junta, specifically inquiring about cooperation regarding rare earth minerals.
This exchange perfectly encapsulates the friction between human rights imperatives and raw supply chain security.
How so?
The U.S. explicitly acknowledges its deep systemic concerns regarding the human rights record of the junta in Myanmar. However, the transcript does not close the door entirely.
So they might still work with them.
It states that if an opportunity arises that directly serves a critical U.S. national interest, such as securing diversified access to the rare earth elements essential for advanced technology and defense manufacturing, the U.S. will explore it.
Wow.
It is a highly cautious, strictly transactional approach to a deeply problematic regime, driven entirely by the realities of global resource competition.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, pulling on threads from every corner of the globe. Let's synthesize the board.
We definitely should.
We started by looking at a sprawling global control panel, and what the transcript reveals is that every single wire is interconnected. We've examined how the U.S. Navy's defense of commercial shipping lanes in the Middle East is fundamentally tied to China's massive energy requirements, forcing an uneasy alignment on maritime security.
Right.
We've seen how the industrial demands of sustaining the Ukrainian defense have actively drained the U.S. military supply closet, delaying critical weapon shipments to Taiwan and forcing a painful reckoning within the defense industrial base.
The fractional reserve security we talked about.
Exactly. We uncovered that the demographic collapse of Cuba wasn't just a product of internal mismanagement, but was hyper-accelerated by the loss of a Venezuelan oil arbitrage scheme that the regime relied on for a hard currency.
A detail a lot of people miss.
And we mapped how the U.S. is attempting to manage this dizzying array of compounding crises with a radically streamlined National Security Council, pushing the analytical burden back to the legacy agencies to execute the directives of a highly centralized executive branch.
If there is a unifying theory to be extracted from this material, it is the concept of precarious equilibrium.
Precarious equilibrium.
Yes. The United States is currently attempting to execute a seemingly contradictory strategy. They are actively working to deter systemic adversaries while simultaneously relying on those same adversaries as indispensable nodes in the global supply chain.
Which is a massive tightrope to walk.
At the same time, they are attempting to reassure anxious allies that the American security architecture remains robust, even as the physical limitations of their industrial base are laid bare. It leaves us with a critical structural question to consider for you, the listener.
What's the question?
As we analyze this deeply integrated global system, where U.S. law enforcement is negotiating fentanyl chemical precursors in Beijing on the same day the State Department is managing maritime clashes in the South China Sea, where adversaries are critical trading partners and allies are competing for the same finite pool of defense resources, are we entering an era where the traditional boundary between warfare and economics has been entirely erased? If the great power conflicts of the 21st century are not fought with carrier strike groups and nuclear arsenals, but are instead waged through supply chain embargoes, precursor chemical restrictions, and targeted export controls, is the architecture of our 20th century military alliance system fundamentally equipped to provide deterrence?
Think about that interconnected control panel. If the critical levers aren't controlling troop movements, but are instead controlling fiber optic data flows, rare earth mineral processing, and LNG shipping routes, the rules of the game have fundamentally changed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the underlying mechanics of the headlines, keep looking for those hidden systemic connections, and we will see you next time.